Hello everyone, and welcome back to U.S. History. Now we begin Season 8. It's Unit 8, but we're on YouTube, so I like calling them seasons and episodes. Let's roll with it. Okay, in this unit, we are going to take a look at multiple presidents, multiple significant events. We'll look at President Lyndon B. Johnson and the events around his presidency. We're going to look at the Civil Rights Movement as a whole. And we will also learn about the Vietnam War. So I'm going to highlight a handful of our objectives for this unit. First, describe Johnson's Great Society. Describe the case of Brown versus the Board of Education and its effect on segregation, particularly in schools. Describe how the Montgomery bus boycott was a turning point for the Civil Rights Movement. Discuss the different methods of protest during the Civil Rights Movement. Describe the background of the Vietnam War and the escalation of the U.S. involvement. Describe U.S. strategies and frustrations during the Vietnam War. And then summarize and discuss the Watergate scandal of Nixon's presidency and describe the events surrounding the Iran hostage crisis. You may not realize it, at least yet, but that is a lot to cover, so let's get right to it. We're not going to try and do all of it in one video. We're going to start today with Lyndon B. Johnson. President Johnson, born in 1908 in Central Texas. In 1934, he married the famous Lady Bird Johnson, who we here in Austin know and love so much. Before he became president, he was elected to the House of Representatives and the Senate. In his time in the Senate, he was the youngest ever minority leader, the leader of the minority party in the Senate. Just straight up blowing down the breezeway. Great timing. And there the leaves go. Today our guest speaker is our groundskeeper at my apartment complex. In 1960, Johnson ran as the vice president alongside John F. Kennedy, who was running for president at that time. And then in 1963, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson became president of the United States. And Johnson, in that initial year from 63 to 64, really did his best to carry on the legacy and traditions laid out by John F. Kennedy. But when he ran for re-election in 1964, he was clear that it was going to be his presidency and his policies going forward. Johnson was a self-declared New Dealer, as in he was a fan of the policies of the New Deal put forward by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Johnson had a vision for the United States, for his country. He called it the Great Society, and in May of 1964, Johnson laid out what he saw that Great Society as looking like. The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice. The Great Society is a place where every child can find knowledge to enrich his mind and to enlarge his talents. It is a place where the city of man serves not only the needs of the body and the demands of commerce, but the desire for beauty and the hunger for community. Johnson would go on to lay out several policies and different agencies he wanted to create in order to make this great society happen, to turn America into this great society. One of the greatest campaigns of Johnson's Great Society was when he declared war on poverty. As a part of that declaration of war on poverty, Johnson persuaded Congress to pass two very important agencies that are still around today, Medicare and Medicaid. Johnson also supported the public broadcasting service, as in Sesame Street. If you watched Sesame Street, you know who Big Bird is. You can thank President Johnson for making Big Bird a reality. Johnson also wanted to invest in education, and not just for some, but for everyone. And one of those areas that he invested in and that he encouraged governments around the country to invest in were Head Start programs to give kids a head start so that when they got into kindergarten, first and second grade, they were able to advance more quickly because they had already learned some of the basics. In relation to the Civil Rights Movement, Johnson would play a pivotal role multiple times, particularly when it came to legislation. Johnson was opposed to segregation. In 1964, President Johnson signed into law the historic Civil Rights Act. and he did so on national television in this massive ceremony at the White House. This was the largest and most sweeping civil rights bill since Reconstruction in the 1870s. The bill prohibited racial discrimination in employment and education. It outlawed racial segregation in public places such as schools, buses, parks, and swimming pools. Johnson also signed into law the Voting Rights Act, the act that banned literacy tests that were discriminating against African Americans, particularly in the southern states. The Voting Rights Act provided federal oversight of voter registration in areas where less than 50% of the non-white population had not registered to vote. And it authorized the U.S. Attorney General to investigate the use of poll taxes in state and local elections. Now, we can't talk about Johnson without talking about the event that would define his presidency, and that's the Vietnam War. Now, we'll cover this in more depth at a later video, but let's get some background first. It all starts really, with the French, who controlled French Indochina, and the Vietnamese threw them off in 1954, and the French were kicked out, led by, the Vietnamese forces were led by a guy named Ho Chi Minh, who was actually a pretty big fan of the United States, and even in some speeches in the 50s cited the Declaration of Independence. But Ho Chi Minh was a communist, and so the United States didn't want anything to do with him. Like South Korea and North Korea, Vietnam was divided north and south. The United States wanted to support South Vietnam, as its government was non-communist. To help South Vietnam in their struggle against North Vietnam, John F. Kennedy sent 900 military advisors to South Vietnam to assist in and support their military. That would later escalate to around 16,000 by 1963. So Johnson inherits this Vietnam situation, and then something happens. There's an attack on a U.S. ship in the Tonkin Gulf, and then Congress passes legislation that gives the president the power to act, the power to take any means necessary to defend U.S. interest anywhere in the world. Initially, the intervention by the United States into South Vietnam and North Vietnam was popular among American people. Okay, this was, once again, we're defending these people against an oppressive, invasive force. North Vietnam to South Vietnam. That was the perspective. But over time, things began to progress in a way that wasn't good, particularly in the media. Things turned sour for Johnson, and the public turned against him. And in 1968, after a massive offensive by the North Vietnamese forces called the Tet Offensive, Americans were convinced this war is never going to end and wanted to get out. Protests amped up all across the country. It was clear Johnson had lost the trust of the American public. And in 1968, he declined to run for re-election. Johnson's dream at the end of his life was peace. He wanted this Vietnam War to end. Sadly, he never got to see the end, because in January 22nd, 1973, Johnson suddenly passed away from a heart attack. But what about his legacy? He will forever be remembered as John F. Kennedy's vice president. And that photo of him being sworn in aboard Air Force One alongside Jackie Kennedy is absolutely going to stand out in his legacy. Medicare and Medicaid are important aspects of American life to this day and are constantly talked about in political discussion. That goes back to Johnson. Sesame Street and PBS. Who doesn't love Sesame Street? Who doesn't love Big Bird? Then you got the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. One of my favorite exhibits at the Johnson Library in Austin is you can go up and pick up a phone off the wall and listen to Johnson's conversations with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was during Johnson's presidency that we would see the massive boom in American space exploration. And then at the end, we saw the Vietnam War. And it would be years and years of struggle in that regard. Most presidents are polarizing, few more so than Johnson. Most presidents make waves, like a stone tossed into a pond. Johnson was more like a boulder. He was a force, for better or for worse. The ripples of his presidency are still felt around us to this day. Thank you for your time today, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I love you all. Make it a great day.